All right, hey everybody. We are continuing on today in our series, Freedom. The last several weeks we have been going through this series called Freedom, going through the book of Galatians and digging into it, discovering what's in there, talking about it, and so we're so excited to continue on with it. This book is one of Paul's letters out to the churches. This was a really important book, and one that as we study it, we see that it was potentially one of the very earliest letters that Paul wrote to churches that he had visited before, and he had been helped to plant these churches in Galatia, which scholars consider to have been in the southern part of what is modern-day Turkey. And so Paul had probably written this letter sometime around 48 AD, and again, they argue it was one of his earliest letters. And that's interesting because as we think of kind of the post-Christ world, what was going on in these Roman provinces, the early church was spreading incredibly. Churches were popping up all over. Literally the region was changing because of what was happening with Christianity. And so this letter is very important because Paul was addressing concerns of what he had heard in this Galatian church, which was still very young, probably very personal to Paul, since he most likely would have known these people. He had concerns that the gospel that he had preached to them was being distorted, that what he had preached was not what they were now believing, that the Judaizers were coming in and were trying to bring them to a place of legalism, believing that they needed the old Mosaic law to really be saved, that it was not Jesus it was not because of him, because of his life and death, brought us out of death and life, but this understanding that the good church in Galatia was being misunderstood, that they thought, well, no, maybe it's because of our efforts that we need to earn our salvation, and then we need to work to keep it. And so Paul was very concerned about that. And so we pick up in chapter 5, in verse 9 is where we'll pick up. And the title of my message today is Life and Death. Specifically, freedom in the Spirit is a matter of life and death for me and for others. And so we're going to turn to the passage in Galatians 5, again starting in verse 9, if you will read along with me. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I am confident in the Lord you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion, whoever that may be, will have to pay the penalty. Brothers and sisters, if I am still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, for you will be destroyed by each other. So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. I'm going to begin my talk today with an understanding of life and death. Specifically an understanding that the path to either life or death can often start very small. That the path to freedom or bondage can often start very small. So we see here that Paul is writing to the church in Galatia out of concern that they are having the gospel distorted to legalism. Again, this understanding that it was not about Christ's life and death being the basis to bring us from death into life. But again, Paul was concerned that these Judaizers, these outsiders, these agitators, as he called them, were trying to control them to get back into a system of believing that it was all about their efforts to earn salvation and then their efforts to keep it. And so we have this picture of a road to either life or a road to death. And so, again, that can start very small, and Paul knew that all it took was just a little bit of inroads to just accept that a little bit and to see what that could grow into. I've learned so much about baking from my fiance. And I bring this up because I've learned so much about the importance of very small details and how it can work and grow, how it can work out. So my fiance's family, they love to cook, specifically baking. They have this family cookbook that has been passed down for generations, specifically for dessert. And they are very intense about it. Specifically for making pies, it is mind-blowing, the ingredients, and also cakes as well. For pies, for example, it is so specific about even the type of water that is used and how many numbers of ice cubes have to be in the water in order to get the crust just perfect. It is unbelievable. And the same goes into how cakes are made according to how intense these recipes are. And so I've learned so much already just about baking just by observing this. And so I just think of baking a cake, how the ingredients have to be just right, and how even if one thing is off or if something is in there that's not supposed to be there, it's going to throw the whole thing off, and really you're going to know. Like I think about you're mixing up a bunch of cake batter. If you just put even just a fair amount of hot sauce in the cake batter, it would ruin the whole thing, right? Like you would know this is not a cake. You would be able to taste the hot sauce regardless in the cake, right? That's just wrong. That would not work. And so I think that's the danger of getting something into the recipe that's not supposed to be there. Can eventually work its way through. And Paul knew this as he was talking about this issue. Or if we're thinking about baking bread, bread, this is the craziest thing to me. If bread gets moldy, has a little spot of mold on it, you can actually save the bread if you get rid of the mold. That's the craziest thing to me, because now I'm like, oh, there was a spot with mold on it. I don't want to eat that bread ever again. I don't care if you say it's good. But in theory, the idea is you can get rid of the mold, something that's not supposed to be there, and you can save the loaf, right? And so that's a very important principle as we're thinking about our theology and thinking about how do we understand the gospel, that really we have to have a proper perspective. And that's what Paul was really writing for, that the church in Galatia had a proper perspective on what the gospel was. That they needed to be guarded against ideas. And the same is true for us, guarded against ideas that make us think that salvation and its purpose is really all about our efforts. Because ultimately that type of self-centered understanding of the gospel will lead to destruction and lead to bondage. So we have to be careful who we're listening to. We have to understand, is our understanding of the gospel, is it self-centered or is it Christ-centered? Paul talked about, he asked the question, why am I still being persecuted? Because his gospel was Christ-centered. He was messing up the control system that the old way had set up. I love, in the Message translation, Eugene Peterson talks about how he uses the language of humans have often used religion as a way to manipulate and control people for their own agendas and their own efforts. And that's one of the real dangers of kind of me-centered, effort-centered religion. But that's not what the gospel is. The gospel is Christ-centered. It is about freedom because of what Christ has done. His life and death has given us life from death because of him. And that freedom is the road to life. So what is the purpose? That's when we have this freedom. It's to love and serve, as we see in this passage. That's what Paul clearly maps out. What is it supposed to look like once we have this freedom? What are we supposed to do with it? These agitators that Paul talked about were misguided. They really thought that they were doing what God had wanted them to do, but were most likely really blinded to their hypocrisy. That their system was oppressive. This type of religious slavery had become so commonplace. This idea of distorting salvation, again, how it's earned and its purpose. this idea, again, of what a religious control system could do to get, for the example of what were these Judaizers doing in Galatia, to get them focused on kind of rote ritual, to be able to be controlled in what they do, so that they're not out there serving and caring for the needs of the outsiders, but that they're concerned and caring for the concerns of the Roman Empire, versus being specifically of the region. You don't want things messed up too bad if you are a part of the establishment. But that's not what Paul is advocating for. He's advocating for, no, the old way has been fulfilled. Jesus came and he fulfilled the law by being our atonement. And our part of fulfilling the law is not about our efforts to earn what Jesus did, but the law is fulfilled by what he says, loving your neighbor as you love yourself. And if we study this word, what does Paul really mean, love, when we love your neighbor? And what we get when we study the usage of that word is that really what he's saying about the word love is to regard for the welfare of another. And so that's what Paul is saying. Really regard them, their needs, their concerns, their lives, as you do for yourself. That is really the law fulfilled. And we see the example of Jesus, that the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but he came to serve. Jesus has lived and given us that example, and Paul knew that. We see in this passage that Paul says, don't indulge in the flesh, but it's implied, but indulge in the Spirit. And so I just love that kind of imagery of indulge. I think we often have a very negative understanding of the word indulge. A great example is, everyone has their guilty pleasures. Unfortunately, I love Chinese buffets. My brother and I, that's just our love language. We love Chinese food. And, kind of the American way of eating is not you eat till you're full, you eat till you're sick, right? Especially at a Chinese buffet. Again, guilty pleasures. But that's not good. You have this feeling of oh, that was just I feel like that was a waste. I had too much. That was not good. That's overindulgence in something that, gluttony is all about me, right? Versus, what if we were to indulge in helping each other and serving people? If you've ever done something that's made a radical difference to help somebody, that feeling is just unbelievable, and that is such a satisfying feeling of doing the right thing and helping somebody. I really feel like that's the imagery of the gospel, of living that out, that Paul wants us to get. That's what we should be indulging in. That is life at its best. And so again, if we were to do that, we've talked about, our friend Mitchell had mentioned the book Everybody Always by Bob Goff. Really a wonderful book, and it's this idea of, what if you didn't have to have any fears, any barriers, any insecurity, but you just walked into every situation really just trying to love everybody always? What difference would that make in the places you go and the people you meet, with the pain you see, if you would literally be giving life to people? And so just that incredible imagery that we should be having, that we really can have that because we have freedom through the gospel, that we can really give love away like we're made of it, because we are when we are in Christ. But when we are being selfish, we're not, because we're just full of ourselves. And so that's a really important point that I want to make next, is that selfishness, that is actually the road that leads to bondage and leads to death. So we can ask, what is our freedom for? This freedom that we have, what does it lead to? Does it lead me to see Jesus' desires and his concerns higher than my own? Or is that flipped? Do I see my needs as being more important than the needs of others? Again, one is life, one is death. Selfishness creates competition. It creates a fight for survival against each other that ultimately leads in destruction for all. Paul says, in humility, love others as you love yourself. In humility. That leads to life for all. Life is good. It's okay. It's okay to treat yourself, here and there. That's okay. But at the expense of others is not the way of the gospel. That's not the fruit of the gospel. Paul saw how a me-centered gospel could destroy the church from the inside out by creating a competition, by creating really a fight for survival. And so that really was a type of bondage that he wanted to see the church in Galatia free from. And ultimately that is so true for us, that it can really be a prison for us, this selfishness. So we really need to check our motivations. Is Jesus the king of our hearts? Do we want his kingdom, or do we want our own? And so what we can practically do, and I want to walk backwards here, is that we need to serve. We need to find places to love people, to see their pain, to give love away like we're made of it, because that helps break control of selfishness. That helps break control of death. And so again, it's this idea that the road to life or the road to death begins small. It begins with very intentional steps. So if we do that, if we start small, if we give love away like we're made of it, knowing that we are free because of what Christ has done. We don't have to earn it. We're now free just to give it away. And so the more we do that, that breaks the chains of death, of selfishness, and then we are free to walk into life and to give life to others as Christ has done for us. And really the only way that we can do this, that Paul writes, is to walk in the Spirit, to have life that ultimately comes from the Spirit. That he is the one who changes our hearts to lead us into true life. We can throw even as much effort into this as we can, but we have to understand that Christ did this, and he has given us his Spirit to continue to purify us and to lead us more into life and to give life to others. Paul says that the Spirit and the flesh, you can't serve two masters. You have to walk in and live by one. And so as we continue on in this series, you're going to see what is the fruit of the flesh and what is the fruit of the Spirit. One leads to life and one leads to death. And it's very serious that we understand that really true life is found in knowing that our freedom comes from Christ, and that now we can go forward and walk knowing that our life is in the Spirit, and that we can give that life away. I can't say that I love my wife or my neighbor or my brother and neglect their needs. That's not what true love is. That's not being Christ-centered. Because again, that's not the example Christ has set for us. That's being me-centered if I do that. So we need to invite the Spirit every day to be more active in our lives, to assure us of his presence, and to be working to allow us to see others, to love others, to break these bonds of selfishness so we can be unselfish, coming from a place of freedom that Christ died to give us life, so that we can go out and give life and ultimately freedom to all.